Welcome to English Country Life and welcome to the December episode of our series, The Chicken Year, Month by Month. And as you can see, winter is well and truly upon us. Welcome, my name's Fiona, and together with my husband Hugh, we run a small holding homestead here in the UK. In our November episode, we reported it was unseasonably warm, but now, as you can see, we have a winter wonderland upon us. And it might look like it's snowing on film, but actually, that's heavy frost coming off the netting for our netted enclosure. And that's the first thing I want to cover in this episode, because this winter weather does bring challenges for netted enclosures. Second thing I want to cover is support for the chickens in this cold weather, because they are challenged by this cold, and I want to show you what we're doing. And it might be suitable for you. If you're in much colder climates, you may have to do more, but I'll show you what we're doing. Finally, I want to go through flooring types for netted enclosures, because we've been experimenting with different things just to see what works and what's best. I want to show you that and talk to you about the pros and cons, but let's get started with netting care. As I mentioned in the introduction, we are into proper winter weather now, and that can present some challenges, particularly if you've got a fully netted enclosure, as we have. Now, it has to be said, we are very lucky in this location because we are not suffering snow at the moment. But we do know that many parts of the UK, Europe and the US have been dealing with it or are currently still dealing with it. And that causes problems for the netting, because snow on the top of the netting can add a significant amount of weight, and in extreme circumstances can actually break the net. So the best thing to do is to remove that snow at least once a day if you can, because otherwise you do not want that netting bowing and eventually breaking. Having said that, even though we don't have snow, ice is still a problem for us, because that can also form across the top of the netting and actually make the netting incredibly brittle. So I do an inspection as well during the day, and if there's any ice which has formed in a large area, I will make sure it's removed. But I'm also making sure that when it's made the netting brittle, that nothing has actually come onto the top, like a fallen branch from the trees around it, which has caused that netting to break. And that's another thing. I'm actually, every second day, I'm doing inspections at ground level all the way around the base of the netting. And what am I looking for? Well, I'm looking for holes chewed by rodents. Now, even though we don't have food on the floor in the enclosure, and our feeder is a treadle feeder, so it's completely enclosed and away from rats and mice, that doesn't stop them trying to get in and having a look around. So it's important to do that inspection at least every second day, if not once a day. Now, if I do find a hole, what am I going to do? Well, the first thing is I'm going to make sure that that hole is actually tied up, either through zip ties, pulling the sides together, or I'm actually physically going to sew it using a darning needle. It all depends on how big that hole actually is. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put either mouse or rodent bait traps outside of the netting area, so that in the line, because normally you can see roughly where the rodents have actually been walking around or walking up to the netting. There's a tiny little trail. So what I'll do is I'll put a bait box in those areas so that they are more likely to go for that bait there, and actually that should resolve my problem. But that is something which I would recommend if you do have chickens. Have poison bait boxes ready and to hand for both rats and mice, because at some point you will actually attract rodents. It's almost impossible to have poultry and not have mice and rats being curious about your poultry at some point when you have them. So it's a useful thing to have around. Regular viewers to our channel will know that our favoured feeder is the grandpa's feeder, and there's a couple of big reasons for that. The first is that the amount of food lost to wild birds when the chickens are out in the free range field and we're not under avian influenza restrictions, it does mean that no bird can actually get inside unless a chicken stands on the treadle. So the amount of food you're losing to just wild birds coming down, stealing food, running away is minimised completely. The second thing is that actually they're compliant with the current avian influenza restrictions within the UK, because the food is covered at all times. Even when a chicken stands on the plate and the lid lifts to access the food, there is no way that any faeces from wild birds can drop down and hit that food, because the lid is still covering the area that the food is in. So the chickens can still access it, but it complies with the legislation because the food isn't exposed to any contamination. But you might notice I've got a little addition, and that is this little section here, because the only problem that I've got with grandpa's feeders, and bear in mind this one is 10 years old and still looks like new, the only issue I have with grandpa's feeders is that they've got metal foot plates. Now you might remember, if you've been watching this series all through the year, in summer I did a segment on hot weather, and I put a sheet of polystyrene covered with an old tea towel and tied it to the foot plate, and that was so that when hot sun hit that foot plate, it didn't heat it up, which would cause problems for the chickens' feet when they stand on it to access the food. I've got the same problem now in very cold weather, because that cold foot plate is not pleasant for the chickens to stand on to access food. So I've done exactly the same thing again. I've got the polystyrene sheet, I've covered it in an old tea towel, and I've tied it to the foot plate. And now the chickens can stand on that, and it's just a lot more pleasant. And here I'm doing the job for Taffy, because she clearly is a little bit hungry. But I don't know what I'm going to do now. Do I just let the lid down on her? I really don't want to do that. There you go, love. So that works for us, and it does protect the chicken's feet. Drinkers are always a challenge in cold weather like this, because access to water is absolutely crucial. And of course, cold weather like this, the water freezes so easily. So what are we doing? Well, the first thing is we've got all of our drinkers under covers. So that means they're less likely to freeze because they're in an enclosed environment and there's no cold wind actually cooling them down even faster. So this is our shelter that it's in. I'm just going to move that back so you can see the drinker. And there you have it. But I'm going to put the shelter back over. And of course, because we're in the UK, we also have to have the drinkers covered too, because that's part of the avian influenza restriction legislation, actually, which means that it's got to be covered over, so wild bird faeces, just like the food, can't hit the drinkers either. Now what I'm also doing is, first thing in the morning, I'm coming out and filling those drinkers with hot water, and I'm removing all ice that's in there, making sure it's moving, and putting hot water in. Now every time I've said this in the past, I always get a comment to say, but hot water freezes faster than cold water. It's a known phenomenon. And that may be true, but I have the ability to come out multiple times during the day and check that the water hasn't frozen and replace it if it has. So we're very lucky to be able to do that. Now, if you're at work and can't do that, you can put cool water in the morning rather than hot water, which means it should stay liquid for longer. But please, if you can, get someone to come in and just check the drinkers and make sure the chickens can access water during the day, just to be on the safe side. Now, if you're lucky enough to be in the US, there are heated drinkers that you can get, and actually that's a really good option, particularly if you're in one of those US states where the temperatures are particularly low. If you're not in the US, I think you can actually get heated drinkers over here and in Europe, and they kind of look like dog bowls, but you will have to have some kind of power to keep them heated. So it is something to think about. But for us, for the temperatures we've got at the moment, this is sufficient. The first thing we do to make sure the chickens are warm at night is to give them a really good thick layer of bedding material. And we use wood shavings here because we find it's a lot more economical. And we've actually got two types of chickens. So we've got one set who like to perch, and those are our cream leg bars and well summer. And then we have the Orpingtons who, quite frankly, I think it's because they're a heavier breed, they don't like perching, so they actually sleep directly on the bedding. I do pick the the coops every single day, so they're going into a clean coop every night, because I don't want them sleeping on their own feces if I can help it. But what I do is I make sure that they have an extra thick layer of bedding, because clearly they're straight onto that bedding material. And I'm just going to add this last lot in here. And then the second thing I do is to make sure that it's actually fluffed up, because it's really quite important that there's air gaps. It's not compressed wood shavings that are going in. There's air gaps between the wood shavings itself, because that's easier for the chickens to heat it up. But they've actually got about 6 inches deep of wood shavings in here now, which may seem a little bit excessive, but it makes me happy. And you might also have noticed this on the floor and we're wondering what it is. Well, this is actually a hot water bottle wrapped in a towel. And why is it wrapped in a towel? Well, first of all, I'm going to put it in the coop, and I don't want the chickens being scalded. So the hot water bottle serves to give the chickens a little bit of protection from that. And the second thing is that it actually keeps the hot water bottle a little bit warmer. Now, I have been asked on social media why I bother putting this in, because a hot water bottle doesn't stay warm all night. And that's absolutely true. But the UK temperatures here are still actually quite mild. It might look like a winter wonderland, but our nighttime temperatures are consistently between -5 and -3 at the moment. So it's actually not that cold. And the chickens are actually they will be okay, because they're heavily feathered breeds. They can easily cope with that in the coop. But by putting this hot water bottle in, it adds just a little bit of ambient temperature within the coop, which helps chickens just warm up just a little bit more as they fall to sleep. And yes, it won't stay warm all night, but that's fine, because its purpose is just to add that little bit of warmth at the start of the night, just while they're getting settled. Now, in colder climates, there's other things that you can do. So you could add a heater inside. There are specialist coop heaters available, or you could use a brooder plate if you're a breeder, as we are, if the temperatures plummet significantly. And we would do that if the temperatures get very, very low. But as I say, our breeds of chicken don't necessarily need it. And actually, the hot water bottle is more than sufficient at this period, at this point in time. And the other thing that some people do is add heat lamps, but I have to say I'm not a fan of heat lamps in coops, and there's a couple of reasons. The first is they can be a fire hazard, so they have to be placed really quite high up and away from bedding. But the other thing is they're a lamp, so they add light to the coop, and consistent light in a coop can be a problem, because it messes with the chicken's circadian rhythms. The winter period is really quite important for most chickens to actually rest their bodies and stop laying eggs, and just give them that little bit of a break. As soon as a heat lamp is introduced and light is introduced to the coop, it actually can tell the bodies to start laying again, which can put stress on their bodies. So personally, I'm not a great fan of heat lamps, but that's why. But those are two very simple methods to try and help keep your chickens warm in their coops at night. One of the things we do for our chickens to help them keep warm is to give them something called mixed corn, and that is essentially a mix of split peas, whole wheat and dried maize kibble. And it's the dried maize kibble which does the job, because that will raise their body temperature. So 1 hour before they go to bed, I will give them this, because it helps keep them warmer in the coop overnight. Now, if you can't get a hold of mixed corn as a treat for your chickens, sweet corn will do the job just as well. So give them a corn on a cob, or defrost some frozen sweet corn and give it to them, maybe in some hot mash. And you can make the hot mash with their chicken pellets with just some hot water added to it. Mix the sweet corn in. That'll make them really happy and make them warm before they go into the coop at night. But just a little bit of warning, not too much, because it is also incredibly fattening. So let's have a talk about floor coverings for your chicken run, because there's two things to combat. The first is you need to try and avoid it becoming muddy, and the second is trying to avoid the ground becoming completely frozen and solid like a sheet of ice in weather like this. So how do you do it? Well, it's a constant topping up of the covering on the floor. You can't just put it in and not keep topping it up. Now, there's 4 different floor coverings that we have been experimenting with. Our favourite and number one one choice, and let's start with that, are absolutely hardwood wood chippings. But the only problem with those is we've been getting them free from our friendly local tree surgeon. But the issue there is that supply's dried up because we do need it to be thorn free, because clearly we don't want thorns in the base of the chicken's feet. Our second choice would be compressed bales of wood shavings, which we do use for bedding in the coops, but in larger shaving size we would use on the floor here, and that's this kind of size that you can see, and that works really, really well. The third would be straw, and as you can see, the chickens are scratching around, and the only reason that straw becomes the third is because it's more likely, if it does become wet, if it does get snow on it, if it does get rain on it, it's more likely to actually keep absorbing that moisture, and then if you get a cold snap like now, it's more likely to freeze solid. And last but not least are leaves. Now in autumn, when all the leaves are falling from the trees, they're wonderful for the chickens to play in, but unfortunately they do retain a lot of that moisture, the wetness, when it rains and when it snows, and that is more likely to freeze absolutely solid. But for the moment we have got straw available without us having to buy anything else, so this is what the chickens have got, and they're loving spreading it out. But as I said, it's a gradual topping up the whole time. Now the ground in here, because it is so cold, for some of the coverings is solid, so where it's solid I'm adding new coverings so it's dry, it's nice on their feet, and they can have great fun spreading it out for me. So not a lot of work for me, and they're entertained. That's it. That's the December episode of our series, The Chicken Year, month by month, and I hope you found something there that's useful to you. If you have, take a moment and give me a thumbs up down below. If you're not already a subscriber to our channel, come and join us. Hit subscribe and the bell icon. It's a completely free service and you'll be notified of every new video as soon as it goes live. If you've got a question for us, leave it in the comments section and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. But for now, thanks for watching and we look forward to seeing you next time.